Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel. Tonight, we will travel slowly and gently back to England in the 16th century, to the time of Queen Elizabeth I. Let your body relax, and your thoughts grow softer as we open together a quiet chapter from the past and listen to it like a low, distant melody. Elizabeth was not only a queen, she was a symbol of a balanced strength that moved between firmness and wisdom, between caution and cleverness. In this calm story, we will not chase noise or conflict, but we will look for the small details that show how she lived, how she saw the world around her, and how she left a deep mark on her age. Imagine yourself sitting in an old stone hall lit by soft candlelight, while a cool breeze slips through narrow, high windows. Outside, almost no sound reaches you, only the slow echo of guards' footsteps in far corridors as the night grows still and heavy. In that quiet air, the story begins, and the doors of time open before us without hurry. We return to the early 16th century, where England is wrapped in the atmosphere of royal palaces, and whispers never stop about marriages, heirs, and political alliances. In this complicated world, Elizabeth was born in the year 1533, daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. From her very first moments, her path was neither easy nor clear, as if fate itself chose for her a road full of shadows and sharp turns. Imagine the scene in a royal birthing chamber, whose walls are covered with heavy curtains embroidered with gold. Quiet voices of servants mix with the steps of physicians, while everyone waits for the king to come out and announce the birth of a son who will inherit the throne. But the newborn is a girl, a small, quiet child, in a world that was waiting for a boy to carry the crown. No one knew then that this tiny child, who seemed so ordinary, would one day become one of the most powerful rulers in the history of Europe. Her early childhood was not stable, and the warm thread of a mother's care was cut very quickly. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was only 3 years old, leaving behind a daughter who would grow up in cold palace corridors instead of a mother's embrace. Normally, a child grows in the warmth of a mother's lap and her voice, but Elizabeth found herself suddenly deprived of that tenderness. She lived among nurses and tutors, and under watchful, harsh eyes that knew little mercy, in palaces that were beautiful in stone and wood, yet empty in feeling. These early years planted deep caution in her character and taught her how to hide what she felt. It was as if she learned from childhood that appearances are stronger than confessions, and that a gentle, quiet smile can hide fear or worry behind it like a well-drawn curtain. Despite the loss and coldness, her life was not empty of care, for she received an education that was unusual for girls at that time. She studied Latin, Greek, and French, and from her earliest years she showed sharp intelligence and a strong memory that absorbed texts and ideas like a thirsty sponge. Books, papers, and ink became part of her daily world, more than toys and simple games. We can imagine a small girl in a modest, dark silk dress, sitting quietly beside a high window, reading in the pale daylight while the wind blows through the garden outside. This early solitude created a contemplative inner world inside her. Elizabeth learned that knowledge is a kind of power, and that words can be more effective than swords when used wisely and at the right moment. Far from noisy feasts and lavish gatherings, she lived an inner life rich with thoughts and imagination. Perhaps this inner richness is what later helped her face the hardest political storms without losing her calm voice or her steady gaze. Her place in the royal family, however, was always fragile and uncertain. After her mother's execution, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, and she lost her official position as a possible heir to the throne. This new status placed her permanently on the edge, neither fully belonging nor completely rejected. Between orphanhood and accusation, her mind grew used to expecting betrayal and protecting itself with silence and careful words. Thus, in those early years, the seeds of the queen that would later inspire awe in all around her were quietly forming. An orphaned child, educated, yet cautious, quiet, and watchful. Every small experience she lived would later become part of the larger picture of her ruling personality. When she passed the first years of childhood, Elizabeth entered adolescence and youth, years carrying challenges no less harsh than those that came before. In the royal court, being the illegitimate daughter of the king was never a simple thing, especially when every change on the throne shifted all balances. After the death of her father, Henry VIII, England entered a period of political and religious turbulence. Her half-brother, Edward VI, took the crown, then later her half-sister, Mary. And with every reign, Elizabeth's position shifted like a light leaf in a changing wind. During the reign of Edward VI, who was younger than she was, her situation was relatively acceptable. She lived in royal residences, respected but not at the center of decision-making, a quiet presence on the edge of power. We can imagine her as a young woman in her early 20s, wearing a dark dress threaded with silver. She sits in a study hall reading classical texts in Latin or Greek, her face calm while her mind works constantly, connecting ideas and weighing every sentence she reads. At that time, she became known for her intelligence and quick mind. Some of her tutors believed she matched great scholars in understanding and depth, and she was never just a quiet princess, but a keen mind that grew more solid year after year. When her sister Mary came to the throne, everything turned upside down again. Mary was a devoted Catholic queen, while Elizabeth leaned toward Protestant beliefs, and that difference was not only religious but deeply political as well. In Mary's eyes, Elizabeth was not just a half-sister, but a direct threat to the crown. Many of the English people saw Elizabeth as a symbol of hope and religious reform, and this made Mary look at her with fear and constant suspicion. In this atmosphere, Elizabeth lived some of the hardest days of her life. She was summoned to London and questioned on charges of conspiracy, and the walls around her closed in with heavy silence. Imagine a cold chamber in the Tower of London. Harsh eyes watch her steadily, questions fall one after another, and every word she says might be used against her in a world that does not forgive mistakes. Elizabeth knew that one wrong word could cost her life, yet she remained outwardly calm. It was as if the years of her childhood had trained her to hide secrets and to keep her voice steady even when fear tried to shake it. She spent a short but heavy period imprisoned in the tower, and the experience left a mark that never truly faded. Between thick stone walls and long dark nights, she must have asked herself whether she would ever again see the open sky or feel sunlight without chains. Even so, she did not let hope die inside her. In the end, she was released, but her life no longer looked the same, and she understood more clearly that surviving in such a political world required doubled caution and a mind that notices every small sign. Elizabeth's youth, therefore, was a long chapter of harsh tests. She moved between trust and suspicion, between freedom and confinement, between hope and fear, and each trial made her more resilient than before. She was no longer just an educated young woman in palaces, but a firm spirit that knew how to hide its anxiety behind a quiet smile and how to wait patiently for the right moment to act. With the passing of years, events moved slowly but surely toward a turning point. That turning point was the moment she would ascend the throne, a moment that would reveal to the world another face of this calm young woman who had grown up among storms. As Mary's reign neared its end, England was wrapped in anxiety and tension. Mary's strict religious policies created deep division among the people, and a time that later became known as a rule of fire and blood. While flames rose in public squares to execute opponents, many eyes turned toward Elizabeth as a possible new beginning. For the people she carried a hope that a different kind of reign might return balance to their country. For Elizabeth, however, this hope was double-edged, carrying with it danger as well as promise. She did not openly seek power, yet she knew that every glimpse in her direction could make her a target for new suspicions from those in control. We can imagine her then in a countryside residence far from London, inside old wooden walls, surrounded by a small circle of loyal servants. She spends her time between reading and needlework, between silence and waiting. Mary had no child, and that fact made the question of succession more urgent with each month that passed. No one seriously doubted that Elizabeth was the natural heir, but the road to the crown was filled with sharp stones. Elizabeth needed to remain calm and avoid any word or action that might be read as open hunger for the throne. It was as if she walked along a narrow bridge above a dark abyss, knowing that one reckless movement could send her falling. Even so, she quietly strengthened her position, relying on her broad education and her ability to show official loyalty to her sister while holding different beliefs in her heart. She had already learned in earlier years that survival sometimes lay more in silence than in loud declarations. At the same time, all of England was watching, from common people to nobles and foreign ambassadors, each speaking of her as the likely successor. Gradually, her image took shape. A calm young woman, steady, strong in nerves, able to endure storms without breaking, and many began to see in her the firmness that a troubled country might need. When Queen Mary died in the year 1558, the decisive moment arrived. Elizabeth was 25 when she was invited to take the crown. And that day was not just the start of a reign, but the opening of a whole era that would later bear her name. Before we enter the ceremonies of coronation and what came after, it is worth pausing to look at this final phase of her youth. It was like a last examination in which she proved that patience can be the strongest weapon and that caution can protect more than any army. She emerged from these years as a woman who understood deeply what ruling meant. It was not only a throne and a crown, but a complex game of loyalties, fears, words, and silences that had to be balanced like fragile glass. On a quiet winter morning in early 1559, London woke to an unusual sight. Streets were decorated with colourful cloth and raised flags, and people gathered in squares and alleys, waiting for the coronation procession to pass. The sound of bells spread through the air, mixing with the smell of burning wood that drifted from fireplaces into the pale daylight. In this solemn atmosphere, Elizabeth's journey toward becoming Queen of England began. When she appeared before the crowds, she wore a shining white silk robe that symbolized purity and hope. Behind the splendor, her heart was heavy with responsibility, for she knew that the throne was not an ornament but a long test full of difficult decisions and constant threats. Despite all that, she looked calm and steady, confident in her steps as she moved slowly along the planned path. She had learned in childhood and youth that controlling appearance was more important than exposing inner emotions. In Westminster Abbey, the coronation rites took place in a scene filled with reverence. Picture the great dim hall lit only by long candles, the solemn Latin prayers rising from the voices of clergy, and deep music echoing between the high stone walls. When the crown was placed upon her head, it was more than a religious ritual. It was an official announcement of the beginning of a new age, an age that would tie her name forever to the history of her island kingdom. The people greeted her with a mix of relief and hope. England needed stability after years of division, and many who had first known her as Henry's daughter and the child of Anne Boleyn now saw a woman who had survived every storm set against her. There was a widespread feeling that this young queen would bring something different, a blend of firmness and cleverness that might fit the times. Elizabeth herself stood at the threshold of an uncertain future, fully aware that challenges awaited her from every direction. Inside the country, there were those who doubted her legitimacy and hated her faith. Outside it, powerful European monarchs looked at England as a tempting target, small in land, yet strategically important. In that moment, she seemed to grasp the deepest lesson of her life. That ruling is not waiting for safety, but facing the unknown day after day with clear eyes and a steady soul. From the very beginning of her reign, there was no gentle, gradual start. The day she sat on the throne was the same day the real burden of rule began. England was sharply divided between Catholics and Protestants, and the wounds of religious conflict were still open and sore. The new queen needed to find a middle way between two hostile sides and create a balance that would keep her kingdom from tearing itself apart. From the earliest days, she showed an ability to make firm decisions while keeping an outward calm. She issued what later became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, an attempt to craft a middle formula between Catholic and Protestant beliefs. It was not a perfect solution, but it gave the people a sense of stability after years of fear and sudden change. We can imagine the crowded royal chambers filled with clergy and councillors, while Elizabeth examines every article with care. Faces around her look tense and serious, while she maintains her faint, mysterious smile and her quiet, confident tone. Religion, however, was not the only trial she faced. As a woman on the throne, she was met with doubt from many nobles in a society used to seeing kings as warlike men in armor, not slender queens in embroidered gowns. Elizabeth looked like a strange exception to them, yet she never allowed those looks to weaken her. Instead, she used her sharp intelligence and persuasive speech to impose her presence on council and court alike. Her words became one of her strongest weapons, no less effective than armies drawn up in lines. In those early years, her real personality slowly stood out, not just the image but the inner core that guided her decisions. She was not only a beloved queen, but one whose anger was truly feared. She knew when to show softness and when to hint at force, and in meetings with her privy council she would listen at length, then speak calmly and firmly to give the final word. Her presence in the palace was like a long shadow that did not need to shout, yet was felt everywhere. In the streets people whispered about their new queen, some seeing in her the wronged daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom fate had restored to her proper place. Others saw a woman of steel, harder in spirit than many men. In all cases, there was a growing sense that this queen was unlike those who came before and that she possessed some inner secret that made her unbreakable. These first challenges shaped her image as a ruler with a quiet yet firm grip. She did not show wild violence or reckless haste, but relied on balance and caution. And as time passed, her enemies realized that behind her gentle smile lived a political mind not easily defeated. It did not take long after Elizabeth's accession for doubts and dangers to surround her from within. Many refused to accept her as a legitimate queen for religious reasons or because of questions about her birth, and those doubts often turned into plots. In England, most Catholics looked at her as a usurper of the throne and placed their hopes in her cousin Mary, Queen of Scotland, whom they saw as the rightful heir. From that moment, Mary became a permanent danger in Elizabeth's life, either directly or as a banner for hidden conspiracies. Imagine the royal court in that period. Wide halls filled with low murmurs, watchful glances, secret letters passed under tables or hidden inside folds of clothing, and each day brought the possibility of discovering a new plot. Elizabeth could never truly sleep with a peaceful mind. She had to assume that betrayal might come from any of those close to her, and that trust was a luxury she could rarely afford. Among the most famous conspiracies were the Northern Rebellion and the Ridolfi Plot. They were attempts to overthrow Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne with the help of foreign powers. And even though they failed, their mere existence wrapped the court in a constant fog of suspicion. Even in the face of such danger, Elizabeth did not resort to blind cruelty. She moved carefully, gathering evidence step by step, then giving her final judgment quietly yet with undeniable severity. She understood that excessive punishment might create more enemies, while too much softness might invite further rebellion. So she chose a middle road where conspirators were punished, but the kingdom did not drown in blood. Another pressing question hung constantly over her head, the issue of marriage. A reigning queen who remained unmarried was a constant subject of argument and pressure. For some believed marriage would strengthen her legitimacy, while others feared a foreign husband might dominate England. Every proposal of marriage carried with it tangled political consequences. Some nobles imagined themselves as possible husbands and future kings, and every refusal could turn into hidden resentment or cold hostility. In this dense atmosphere, Elizabeth showed remarkable skill in maneuvering. She did not rush into decisions, but waited for the moment she judged best, using time as her ally rather than her enemy. Each plot was a lesson, and every possible betrayal a chance to understand the hearts and ambitions of those around her more clearly. She knew that ruling England meant not only sitting on the throne, but also understanding how to control minds and emotions. These years of conspiracies and internal threats did not weaken her position in the eyes of her people. On the contrary, they made her appear stronger, a queen who did not collapse under fear, but held on to her calm, even in the darkest hours. Among all the dangers Elizabeth faced, none was more serious or longer lasting than the threat of her cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. Mary was a young woman with a strong presence, a devoted Catholic, and a royal figure surrounded by many supporters who believed she should rule England. Her very existence made Elizabeth's rule feel as if it rested on fragile ground. When Mary was forced to give up her throne in Scotland in the year 1567, after a chain of crises, she fled to England seeking refuge. And here, Elizabeth's great dilemma truly began. How would she deal with a royal relative who could at any moment become the center of a rebellion against her? We can imagine an old English castle hall where Mary in her fine clothes sits under guard, her face bright yet confined, while news flows in day by day about supporters planning in her name. For Elizabeth, the situation was like having a small hidden fire under the floor, always ready to flare up. Through long years, Mary remained a prisoner inside England, not in a dark cell, but inside remote castles far from London under strict supervision. Despite the restrictions, secret letters continued to reach her and leave her. She stayed at the heart of repeated plots that aimed to kill Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne instead. One of the most famous of these conspiracies was the Babington plot in the year 1586, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. Elizabeth's intelligence services, among the first organized spy networks in Europe, managed to intercept the coded messages. At that point, Elizabeth realized that Mary was no longer just a political burden, but a direct threat to her life. The decision about Mary was not easy, for she was a queen of royal blood, and executing her would break traditional rules and stir anger across Catholic Europe. Yet Elizabeth saw no other path that could fully remove the danger. In the year 1587, the death sentence was carried out against Mary, Queen of Scotland, in a scene heavy for everyone present, and heavy even for Elizabeth herself. After all, Mary was her cousin and a queen like her, but politics rarely knows mercy. Elizabeth understood that her own rule might not survive if this threat was allowed to burn beneath the surface. By ordering Mary's execution, she sent a clear message that she was able to take the harshest decision when it came to the safety of her crown. From that day, European rulers saw her as even more unyielding and sometimes more frightening. She became the queen who did not let blood or kinship stand in the way of her authority. The long chapter of suspicion and hidden fear surrounding Mary ended in a single decisive act, and that act shaped the image of Elizabeth's rule for many years. After she had faced and surpassed the most serious internal dangers, especially the long problem of Mary, Elizabeth entered a new stage of her reign. Survival was no longer the only goal. Now she needed to consolidate her authority and present herself firmly as an unshakable monarch. She realized that power is not built by swords alone, but also by symbols and carefully chosen words. For this reason, she paid close attention to how she appeared in public, to her clothes, her jewels, and the way she moved in front of the crowd. She wore striking garments bright with colors and heavy with shining decoration to give an impression of sacred majesty. In official processions, she sat in luxurious carriages drawn by horses while people lined the streets to see her, waving and calling out blessings as she passed. These were not simple celebrations, but deliberate political messages that said, "The Queen is here, strong and present, and no one rivals her place." Her image alone, however, could not carry the whole burden, so she also devoted care to the way she spoke to her people. Sometimes she addressed soldiers or common citizens directly using simple yet powerful language. She did not shout or rush, but spoke slowly and confidently, leaving those who heard her feeling that their queen understood them and cared for them. Under her rule, England began to grow economically. Trade expanded, especially with new sea voyages that opened doors to distant lands and new sources of wealth, and the markets of London reflected this change. Merchants displayed rare fabrics, spices from the East, and silver and gold from the New World. These gains did not reach everyone equally, but they helped strengthen the image of a kingdom rising in power and standing more firmly on its feet. At the same time, Elizabeth kept the same careful balance that had marked her youth. She did not drown her people in taxes and did not drag the country into large civil wars, preferring a policy of moderation that allowed room for daily life to continue. She left people enough freedom to feel relatively content while keeping the final control firmly in her own hands. Over time, many began to see in her not only a queen but also a kind of protective mother for the nation. They called her the Virgin Queen, and saw in that title not only her unmarried state but also a symbol that she had devoted herself entirely to England. To them, it was as if she had chosen to be mother of a nation rather than wife of any man. This image did not appear from nothing. It arose from long years of cautious maneuvering between fear and hope, between harshness when needed and mercy when possible. While England's inner balance improved and its external image grew stronger, storm clouds were gathering on the wider European horizon. These clouds were not of English winter rain, but signals of an approaching clash with the greatest power of that time, Catholic Spain under King Philip II. Spain in the 16th century was an immense empire stretching from Europe to its colonies across the ocean. Vast treasures of gold and silver were carried home in its fleets, making it the richest and most influential power of its age. Beside it, England looked small and limited in resources, dependent on rising trade and the skill of its sailors. Still, the tension between the two kingdoms was rising like hidden fire. The first cause was religion. for Elizabeth's fixed Protestant policy was seen by Spain as a direct threat to the Catholic faith it championed. The Pope in Rome considered her an unlawful queen, while Spain saw itself as defender of Catholicism. Every religious decision taken in London was felt in Madrid as a challenge or insult. The second cause lay in trade and the open seas. English seamen, led by figures like Francis Drake, began attacking Spanish ships loaded with treasure, acts that were known as licensed privateering. Elizabeth secretly granted them letters allowing them to seize foreign ships in exchange for a share of the loot. And although she denied direct involvement, Philip knew well that England benefited from weakening his fleets. Behind all this was a web of political conflict. Spain supported Catholic conspiracies inside England, especially those linked to Mary Stuart, while England encouraged resistance to Spanish rule in the Netherlands. Each side saw the other as an enemy whose danger was gradually increasing. Daily life in England began to reflect this distant tension in subtle ways. In the ports, sailors spoke about Spanish ships and the fortunes a bold raid might bring. In markets, merchants watched the prices of spices and foreign goods, fearing Spanish moves that might cut off trade routes. In churches, preachers hinted that England faced a great danger that was not only political but also religious. As the years went by, it became clear that open conflict was no longer a distant possibility. Spain, with all its naval power, began planning a major military campaign against England. Elizabeth, aware of the gap between the two countries, did not show fear, but quietly continued to support her captains and encourage exploratory voyages, as if insisting that England would not bow before any empire. Thus, the relationship between the two powers turned into a slow-rising confrontation. It was not only about sea routes and wealth, but about who would hold the louder voice in guiding the future of Europe. As the 80s of the 16th century drew toward their end, all of Europe began to wait for an inevitable clash between small England and mighty Spain. King Philip II no longer relied on plots and indirect pressure, and decided that the time had come for a great military campaign to bend England and return it to the Catholic faith. Thus, the idea of the Spanish Armada was born, the fleet that was then considered the greatest naval force ever assembled. It was made up of hundreds of large ships, some of them towering like floating castles, filled with thousands of soldiers and cannons and carrying supplies and horses across the sea. On paper, the picture was terrifying. A massive armada would cross the English Channel, land an army on English soil, and put an end to Elizabeth's rule. In England, people followed the news with deep concern and uneasy hearts as rumours mixed with fear in homes and taverns. In small London inns, men spoke in low voices about the fleet that could not be defeated. Women in the markets listened to stories brought by Dutch traders about Spanish ships moving like a forest of masts across the water, and even in far villages, farmers wondered if foreign soldiers would one day march along their muddy roads. Elizabeth knew how weak her country's resources were compared to the Spanish giant, yet she did not show fear in public. Instead, she chose to turn people's anxiety into a quiet national challenge, giving direction and purpose to their worry. She invested in improving the Navy and supported talented sea captains like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, giving them wider authority to prepare. One of the key differences between the two sides lay in the nature of their ships, a detail that would later change history. Spanish ships were huge and heavy, more like floating palaces than agile vessels. By contrast, the English relied on smaller, faster ships, equipped with good cannons and able to maneuver lightly and sharply around their slower enemies. This difference, which might seem small at first glance, had a powerful effect when the time of battle came. Preparation took place not only at sea but on land as well, and along the coast, new defenses were built and local militias organized. Farmers were trained to handle spears and bows, as if their ordinary lives might at any moment be drawn into a great war. Even with all these efforts, no one truly knew whether the preparations were enough, or if England would still be overwhelmed. During this tense time, Elizabeth showed her political skill in a remarkable way. In 1588, she visited the English camp at Tilbury, and there she delivered the speech that would echo in memories for centuries. She wore a light breastplate over her royal clothes and stood before her soldiers declaring that, though she had the frail body of a woman, she possessed the heart of a king and the soul of the King of England. Her words were calm yet strong enough to plant courage in the hearts of the troops and to turn fear into a quiet, proud resolve. That moment captured everything that distinguished her reign: the ability to turn weakness into a source of strength, and to use symbols and language to unite her people. From that day, soldiers and common folk spoke of her with deeper reverence, as if she were a living embodiment of England itself. The Armada had already set sail, and the sea was about to become the stage for one of the greatest naval encounters in history. When the Spanish fleet crossed the English Channel in the summer of 1588, the first sight of it was like a scene from an epic. Dozens of huge ships flew their banners, marked with the cross of Catholic Spain, moving slowly and grandly over the waves. From a distance they looked like a floating forest of masts glinting in the sunlight, a sight meant to create awe and fear in every watcher. The English, however, led by their experienced seamen, were ready for this unequal confrontation. Their small, swift vessels were like seabirds, circling around a great heavy creature, and they were careful not to come too close to the lumbering Spanish giants. Instead, they used their speed to their advantage, attacking from calculated distances, firing their cannons, and then slipping away before the heavy Spanish ships could respond accurately. The channel turned into a vast field of noise and smoke, where chaos and rhythm blended together. The sounds of gunfire echoed like distant drums, followed by thick clouds of smoke that filled the air with the smell of gunpowder. From time to time, the waters shook under the impact of solid shot, smashing into wood, while splinters and debris flew out over the waves. One of the English tactics showed their ingenuity clearly: the use of fireships. On a dark night, they sent small vessels loaded with tar and straw, set ablaze, and allowed them to drift into the anchored Spanish formation. The moving flames created terror among the Spanish sailors, who feared exploding powder and burning hulls, and they hastily cut anchor ropes and scrambled to escape. In the resulting confusion, their close ranks broke apart and the once ordered fleet turned into scattered groups. The disarray was a priceless chance for the English ships, which then attacked the separated vessels and further shredded the Armada's strength. Yet it was not cannon fire alone that decided the outcome. Nature itself entered the battle. Strong winds rose and heavy rains lashed the sea, driving the Spanish ships northward away from their planned course. Many vessels were wrecked as they tried to return by sailing around Scotland and Ireland, and the proud vision of an invincible fleet dissolved into a maritime disaster. In England, the news was received with relief and astonishment. People who had been quietly expecting an invasion woke to find that the greatest danger had faded in a matter of weeks. The country had not built a fleet larger than Spain's, but it had shown flexibility, skill, and a powerful, unexpected ally: the weather. Elizabeth used the victory with careful wisdom, not drowning the moment in noisy celebration, but letting a shared feeling of deliverance spread gently through the nation. In her speeches, she spoke of divine providence and of the steadfastness and unity of her people. It was as though she told the English that the triumph did not belong to her alone, but to them all, and that thought made them feel even closer to her. In Europe, however, the scene looked very different. Kings and Catholic clergy saw the defeat of the Armada as a blow to a power that had long been considered the right hand of the Pope and the sword of the faith. The defeat did not end Spain's position as a great empire, but it encouraged her enemies. The Dutch felt new hope in their struggle, the French saw a chance to balance Philip, and England gained a new measure of respect, despite its smaller size. In the English court, Elizabeth's image was further strengthened as the queen who could not be conquered. Official portraits began to show her standing firm, surrounded by maritime symbols, ships, waves, and maps of the world, as if the ocean itself were now part of her story. In the famous Armada portrait, she appears upright and proud, while behind her two windows tell the tale. In one, Spanish ships sink among stormy waves and dark clouds, and in the other, English ships sail peacefully on calmer waters, as if guided by a gentler sky. These paintings were not mere decoration, they were political statements, cast in color and light. They declared that England had survived, and that its queen stood at the center of that survival, like a fixed star. Daily life for ordinary people did not magically become easy after the battle. Poverty still existed in the countryside, and cities remained crowded and sometimes struck by disease. Yet the victory changed something deeper, the way the English saw themselves. They now felt part of a larger story, and believed their island was no longer a small isolated corner, but a real player in European affairs. Elizabeth knew how to balance pride and caution. She did not rush into wide wars of conquest, nor did she waste the nation's strength recklessly. Her policy remained measured and protective, seeking to guard what had been gained more than to chase distant dreams. Still, the image shaped by the Armada years stayed at the heart of her legend, the queen tied to sea, winds, and unlikely triumph. As the end of the 16th century approached, England had changed noticeably. It was no longer a nervous island anxiously watching for internal plots and foreign dangers, but a power that others now had to consider seriously. Yet the final years of Elizabeth's rule were not only years of success, they were also years of reflection and accumulating personal burdens that time had quietly laid upon her shoulders. The queen, who had mounted the throne as a lively young woman, was now in her 60s. Her features had altered under the touch of years, yet she made every effort to appear in public in the finest form she could manage. She used thick, white cosmetics to hide the scars left on her face by illness in her youth, and wore splendid robes heavy with jewels and pearls, like a symbolic armor against the gaze of time. As the years passed, a sense of loneliness increasingly crept into her life. She had never married and never borne an heir to the throne. The title of Virgin Queen, which had become part of her legend, was also a reflection of a private reality, a life without a partner in which she relied on loyal counselors and the affection of her subjects. Many nights she spent in her great palace halls, surrounded by servants and courtiers, yet her heart lacked true companionship. In politics, she remained cautious as ever, avoiding great continental campaigns after the Armada while quietly supporting uprisings against Spanish power. She maintained a delicate balance with France and ensured that England had enough strength to defend its interests without overreaching. For a country that had once trembled before invasion, this stable position was a remarkable achievement. Everyday life among her people in these last years also shifted in notable ways. London grew larger and more crowded, its wooden houses lining the banks of the Thames and its streets buzzing with carts, merchants, and travellers. Theatres began to flourish, and William Shakespeare was writing plays that drew together people from many social levels into shared evenings. At night, faint lights glowed from inn windows, while people exchanged stories of the great queen who had stood against Spain, and of an England larger than the one they had known as children. Yet beneath this grand picture there were still difficulties. The economy was not always strong, and some years brought famine and outbreaks of disease. And religious tensions did not completely disappear, even though they were gentler than before. For Elizabeth, despite all her successes, there remained a constant worry, the question of the heir. She knew that her death would open a new and uncertain chapter for England, and that knowledge cast long, quiet shadows across her final years. These last seasons of her life were not solely about political strength, but also about the careful shaping of a legend. People no longer saw her simply as a queen signing orders. They saw in her a symbol of unity and endurance, a face that represented the soul of the nation in a hard age. With time, she ceased to be only a monarch involved in the daily details of rule and became a living emblem for England. In court, in the streets, and even on the stage, her image began to appear as something larger than an ordinary person, as if she were the spirit of the island itself. One of the ways this image was reinforced was through art. Official portraits painted by the best artists were not intimate likenesses, but carefully planned works, often showing Elizabeth in shining gowns, heavy with pearls, symbols of purity and lasting fame. Her features were often depicted without signs of aging, even in her later years, as if she stood outside the circle of time. In the Armada portrait, her tall figure dominates the scene, while around her the pictorial story of England's victory over Spain unfolds so that she appears as the very force that defeated the empire. Alongside painting, literature and theatre played their part. In Shakespeare's plays and in the works of his contemporaries, we find direct and indirect hints at England's greatness and special destiny. Elizabeth's name is not always spoken there, yet she is present in the background as the protecting spirit of this bright cultural age. This link between queen and art meant that her image would live not only in palaces, but in the imagination of ordinary people. Political symbolism also helped fix her most famous title, the Virgin Queen. It was no longer simply a fact of her private life, but a sign that unified the land, as if her unmarried state were a sacrifice made for England itself. People felt that she had chosen to be mother of the nation rather than partner of any man, and this symbolic dimension lifted her position beyond politics into something almost sacred in their eyes. Behind this carefully built image, however, lay a different reality. There was an aging queen living in a palace that grew quieter as the years went by. Many of her old friends and closest advisers had died, and those who remained were themselves touched by age and fatigue. Even the joys that had filled her earlier decades, processions, celebrations, long evenings of conversation and music, were now less frequent. Historians tell of her sitting some nights in her large chamber, wearing a heavy black dress, and staying silent for long stretches as if contemplating the long path behind her. In these years, the great question was what would come after Elizabeth. She had no direct heir, and that absence worried her council deeply. Yet the Queen herself avoided speaking openly on the matter, perhaps because she did not wish to admit that her reign was nearing its end. Perhaps, too, she wanted her memory to remain bound to the living present rather than to a future she would not see. Despite her physical weakness, she still commanded respect, and even a kind of awe from those around her. In her final sessions with the lords of her council, her words were few, but each carried the weight of age and experience. She no longer needed long speeches. It was enough to remind them gently that she had ruled for almost half a century, and that she would leave England far stronger than she had found it. In the streets, people whispered about their ailing queen. Merchants in markets, sailors in harbours, and farmers in fields all wondered whether Elizabeth's age was drawing to a close. Yet alongside their concern, there was a deep sense of gratitude. Many saw her as the fortress that had protected England from inner division and foreign invasion. the hand that had guided them into a new age of confidence. As her end approached, she withdrew from public view step by step. She appeared less often in processions, and spent more of her time in the palace, in a space filled equally with sorrow and memory. Her final departure from the stage of history was quiet. There was no dramatic scene like those that had marked her youth. Instead, she seemed to fade gently, like a long day turning into night. In the spring of 1603, the strong voice of England slowly grew weak. Queen Elizabeth I lay on her bed in Richmond Palace, heavy with years, surrounded by servants and close attendants, while the great chamber was filled with the solemn weight of silence. The woman once known for her skill in speech and persuasion had entered a phase where words were no longer needed. Historians describe how she would sometimes stare for long periods at the ceiling as if reviewing a life full of victories and storms, of harsh decisions and tender moments. On the 24th of March of that year, her death was announced at the age of about 70. The news spread quickly, and from London to the remotest rural villages, a mixture of grief and stunned realization settled on the people. For too many, Elizabeth had been England itself. They had known no other long reign, and hardly imagined a future without her firm and reassuring presence. The funeral procession that carried her body to Westminster Abbey was solemn and grand, but not noisy. Thousands lined the streets to see her for the last time. Some wept openly, while others remained silent, their eyes alone expressing their understanding that an entire age had come to an end. Her coffin, covered with royal symbols, seemed to carry more than a single life. It bore the weight of an era. Though her crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, Elizabeth's shadow remained present in every corner of the kingdom she left behind. She had shaped a relatively unified realm, a stronger navy, a more stable economy, and a rich culture that would later be remembered as part of a golden English age. In Shakespeare's plays, in the seafaring journeys that mapped new regions of the world, and in a people's growing sense of their own importance, we can see her imprint clearly. Her legacy was as complex as her life. She was a woman who ruled in a world that expected leadership from men, and yet she imposed her personality within those limits, and often beyond them. She could be strict, and at times harsh, yet that sternness gave England roughly half a century of relative stability. Perhaps for that reason, even those who criticized her could not deny the depth of her impact. Centuries later, her name still shines as a symbol of the Elizabethan age, an age of art and exploration and growing national independence. When history quietly closes its pages, her story remains one of those tales that whisper in the listener's ear how one person can change the course of a nation, not only through battles but through patience, cleverness, and the ability to remain steady in the storm. In the end, the curtain falls softly on the life of Elizabeth I, the queen who never married, yet bound herself to England as both wife and mother. She departed, but her legacy continues to murmur in the halls of Westminster, in lines of old poems, and in the memory of an entire people. And now we reach the end of our long journey with Elizabeth I, the queen who gave shape to a full era and whose shadow stretched across half a century of English life. Over these hours we have walked through the corridors of her palaces, listened to the whispers of her councils, and felt the weight of the crown she carried for so many years. We saw her difficult beginnings, and how she carved a path through doubt, then how she tightened her grip on the throne, and finally how she met her last years with quiet wisdom and the heaviness of experience. When we gently close these pages of history and look at our own present lives, the difference between her world and ours becomes clear. She lived in a time ruled by constant conflict and shaped by fear of invasion and intrigue, while we rest tonight in a world that, despite its troubles, can still offer us moments of peace she never knew. As we lay our heads on the pillow, we are not asked to carry the burdens of an entire kingdom. We do not face councils full of doubtful men, nor must we answer threatening letters from distant armies. All that is asked of us now is to breathe slowly and allow our minds to drift gently toward deep rest. Elizabeth's legacy, with all its sternness and bright glory, reminds us that time always moves on, and that even the loudest moments in history eventually fade into silence. That same silence now surrounds us as we listen to the story easing down, as if it were dissolving into the soft folds of the night. Let that silence carry you away. Imagine the waves of the Thames flowing slowly in the darkness of old London, and the candles in her distant palace going out one by one. With each candle that fades, sleep draws nearer until it wraps you softly, leaving you safe, far from the noise of kings and close to the simple comfort of your body and your breathing. Here our journey with Queen Elizabeth I comes to a close. The ruler who once terrified her enemies yet now leaves behind only a quiet memory and a gentle companion, inviting you to sink into deep sleep. Good night, and may your rest be calm and peaceful.